Welcome to the fog hut.
When I bought the cabin 2 years ago, the fireplace in the center of the living room had been little more than a decorative relic. I had never seen a reason to use it. Summers were warm, winters manageable with electric heaters, and the thought of cleaning out ash wasn't appealing. But on the night the storm came, the choice wasn't mine to make. The wind howled as if trying to tear the cabin apart, slamming against the windows in violent bursts. Rain lashed the roof, finding every crack and crevice to seep through. Then, with a loud pop and an eerie silence, the power went out. The hum of modern comforts vanished, replaced by the relentless roar of nature. I sat in the dark, staring at the cold hearth, shivering as the temperature dropped. "It's just one night," I muttered, pulling a blanket tighter around my shoulders. But as the hours dragged on, the chill became unbearable, sinking into my bones. My gaze fell again to the fireplace, the shadows around it seeming to deepen in the flickering light of my flashlight. Finally, I gave in. I grabbed the stack of firewood I'd stored for emergencies and set about lighting the fire. The kindling caught quickly, the flames leaping to life with surprising eagerness. Warmth spread through the room, chasing away the cold. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, sinking into the worn armchair by the hearth. The storm raged outside, but here, by the fire, I felt safe. The first sound was so faint I almost missed it, buried beneath the crackling of the flames. It was like a whisper, soft and indistinct, a subtle murmur weaving through the noise of the fire. I leaned forward, straining to hear, but it faded as quickly as it had come. Shaking my head, I told myself it was nothing. The isolation was playing tricks on me, that was all. But then it came again. This time, the whisper was clearer, though still too faint to make out words. It wasn't coming from outside, I realized with a chill. It was coming from the fire. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding absurd in the small room. The flames flickered, their light casting dancing shadows across the walls, but there was no response. I laughed nervously, running a hand through my hair. "Get it together," I muttered. "It's just a fire." The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the warmth of the fire lulled me into a fragile sense of comfort. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the storm and the fire blend into a soothing white noise. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard the whisper again, just loud enough to jolt me awake. Hours passed like this, my mind teetering on the edge of exhaustion. The fire burned steadily, its flames strong and bright, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Finally, as dawn broke and the storm began to wane, I let myself believe the worst was over. The fire had been nothing but a strange distraction, a quirk of the night. The next evening, as the sun set and the cold crept back into the cabin, I hesitated. The hearth was empty now, dark and lifeless. Part of me didn't want to light it again, but the memory of the storm's chill was enough to overcome my reluctance. I stacked the logs, struck a match, and watched as the flames roared back to life. That's when the images began. At first, they were fleeting, barely perceptible movements within the flames. I told myself it was just the natural flicker of the fire, but the shapes grew clearer with each passing moment. Figures danced in the light, indistinct and ethereal, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. The figures resolved into people, a man, a woman, and a child, sitting around a fire much like mine. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their expressions frozen in a mixture of fear and desperation. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was undeniable. And then, as if sensing my gaze, the man turned. His empty eyes met mine, and his lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. The flames surged, the image dissolving into a chaotic swirl of light and shadow. I stumbled back, my heart racing, the heat of the fire searing my skin. "What the hell?" I whispered, staring at the hearth. The fire burned steadily, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd seen. The man had been looking at me, and he had been trying to say something. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat in front of the fire, unable to look away, afraid of what I might see if I closed my eyes. The whispering returned, louder now, distinct and insistent. "Do not let it die." The words echoed in my mind, a command that felt less like a suggestion and more like a threat. I fed the fire, adding log after log, watching as the flames devoured them hungrily. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more demanding, until they were the only thing I could hear. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, my body trembling from lack of sleep. The fire burned strong and steady, its glow filling the room with an unnatural warmth. I stared into the flames, the man's hollow eyes still haunting me, his silent words repeating in my mind. "Do not let it die." Whatever I had awakened, it wasn't going to let me go. The fire wasn't just alive, it was awake, and I could feel its presence in every corner of the cabin. By the second night, it no longer felt like warmth, but like a watchful gaze, unblinking and demanding. I couldn't escape it. Every flicker of the flames seemed intentional, deliberate, as if the fire were trying to communicate. I sat in the armchair, staring into the hearth. My body was exhausted, but sleep eluded me. The whispers came and went, faint at first, then growing louder in the stillness. They no longer blended with the crackling of the fire. They were distinct, insistent. "Keep it alive. Do not let it fade. What do you want from me?" I muttered, my voice trembling. The fire flared in response, the flames twisting and rising as if agitated. I leaned back, clutching the arms of the chair, my pulse quickening. The whispers faded for a moment, leaving only the oppressive silence. The next morning, I decided to step outside. The air was crisp, the sky a muted gray, the forest shrouded in a thin mist. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. The cabin and its infernal fire felt far away, almost unreal, as if I could leave it behind and never look back. But the whispers followed me. They were faint, barely audible beneath the rustling of leaves and the crunch of twigs beneath my boots, but they were there. I shook my head, trying to clear it, and focused on gathering firewood. The logs I'd stacked near the cabin were already running low, devoured by the fire's insatiable hunger. I needed more. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual symphony of birdsong and distant rustling replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. As I ventured deeper, the trees seemed taller, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers. The ground was damp, and the air carried the faint scent of decay. I found a small clearing, the ground littered with fallen branches. Relief washed over me as I began gathering the wood, but the feeling was short-lived. A shadow flitted at the edge of my vision, swift and silent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Just the trees, looming and still. "Get it together," I muttered, forcing myself to focus. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. The shadows seemed to move with me, always at the edge of my vision, never close enough to confront. By the time I returned to the cabin, the fire was dangerously low. The whispers were waiting, their tone sharper, more urgent. "Feed it. Feed it now." I dumped the wood near the hearth and quickly threw a log onto the embers. The fire flared instantly, as if relieved, its flames licking hungrily at the new fuel. I collapsed into the chair, my body trembling, my mind racing. As the flames grew stronger, the images returned. This time, they were clearer. The man from the night before was there again, sitting in front of his own fire. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling as he fed the flames. Behind him, shadows loomed, their forms twisting and writhing, their movements slow and deliberate. The man turned, his eyes meeting mine, his lips moving silently. "Help us." The scene dissolved as the fire surged, the heat driving me back. My heart raced, my skin damp with sweat. The whispers returned, weaving through the crackling flames. "Do not let it die." Sleep was impossible. The fire's glow filled the room, its light casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, his desperate plea repeating in my mind. I stayed by the hearth, adding log after log, afraid of what might happen if the fire went out. The next morning, I found more logs missing from the pile outside the cabin. I had stacked them carefully the day before, yet half of them were gone. At first, I thought animals might have taken them, but there were no tracks, no signs of disturbance. It was as if the wood had simply vanished. Panic set in. Without enough wood, the fire would go out. And if the fire went out, I spent the day searching the forest, gathering as much wood as I could carry. The oppressive silence was back, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each trip. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, but I forced myself to ignore them. I couldn't afford to stop. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, my arms and back aching from the relentless labor. The fire burned strong, but the relief I felt was fleeting. As I sat by the hearth, the flames began to shift again, forming new images. The man was alone now. The woman and child were gone, their absence a palpable void. His face was gaunter, his hands blackened and charred, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He stared at me, his expression a mixture of anger and despair, his lips moving silently. Why? The flames surged, the heat forcing me back, and the image disappeared. I sat there, trembling, the question echoing in my mind. Why? Why had I lit the fire? Why had I kept it alive? And why did I feel like I had no choice but to continue? The answers eluded me, but one thing was clear, the fire wasn't just a burden. It was a prison, and I was its keeper. The third night arrived, and with it, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. The fire's glow dominated the cabin, its warmth no longer comforting but oppressive, as if it were consuming not just the wood but the very air around me. The whispers were louder now, less like voices and more like a presence in the room, circling me, probing. I hadn't eaten much in days. Every moment was spent tending to the fire or gathering wood, and my body was beginning to show the strain. My hands were blistered, my muscles ached, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on me like a lead blanket. Yet, despite the pain, I couldn't stop. The fire wouldn't let me. As I added another log to the flames, the whispers surged, a chaotic murmur that made my skin crawl. I froze, staring into the hearth, my breath catching in my throat. The flames twisted and danced, their movements unnatural, deliberate. And then the images returned. This time, it wasn't the man. The scene unfolding in the fire was different. A dense forest, cloaked in shadows, its trees gnarled and ancient. Figures moved between the trunks, their forms indistinct, their movements erratic. They were searching for something. Or someone. The perspective shifted, the flames pulling me deeper into the vision. I was running now, my breath ragged, my feet pounding against the forest floor. The shadows pursued me, their shapes growing clearer, more menacing. They weren't human, not entirely. Their limbs were too long, their eyes glinting like embers in the darkness. I stumbled, fell, and as I turned to face them, the vision dissolved. I gasped, clutching the armrest of the chair, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire burned steadily, its flames bright and unyielding, as if mocking me. The whispers subsided, but their presence lingered, a weight pressing against the edges of my mind. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The fire offered no answers, only its relentless heat and the faint crackle of burning wood. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the forest than I ever had before. The usual trails felt alien, their familiarity replaced by an oppressive sense of wrongness. The trees seemed taller, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air was colder here, and every step felt like a violation, as if the forest itself didn't want me there. I found a cluster of fallen branches, their bark dark and brittle. As I bent to gather them, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I straightened, my eyes scanning the shadows. Something moved at the edge of my vision, a dark shape slipping between the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the stillness. The forest didn't answer. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the shadows remained still, their presence a silent threat. I grabbed the wood and hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding with every step. The shadows followed, keeping their distance, their movements slow and deliberate. By the time I reached the clearing, the cabin's silhouette was a welcome sight, its walls a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. That night, the fire burned brighter than ever, its flames reaching higher, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The whispers were insistent, their tone sharper, more demanding. Feed it. Keep it alive. I obeyed, throwing log after log onto the flames, watching as they devoured the wood with unnatural hunger. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with smoke and the scent of burning. My hands trembled as I reached for another log, my vision swimming from exhaustion. The images returned, clearer this time. The man was back, but his condition had worsened. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, his hands blackened and raw. He knelt before his fire, his hands feeding it with trembling motions. The shadows surrounded him, their forms slow and deliberate, their presence suffocating. He turned to me, his hollow eyes meeting mine. His lips moved, forming words I could finally hear. You will become me. The vision shattered as the fire flared, its flames licking at the walls, its heat driving me back. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, the man's words echoing in my mind. You will become me. By dawn, the cabin was a wreck. The furniture had been stripped down for fuel, the walls bare and scarred from the fire's relentless heat. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold wood, staring into the flames. My body was shaking, my mind racing. I couldn't keep this up. I couldn't. The whispers had subsided, but their presence lingered, a constant pressure against my thoughts. The fire burned steadily, its glow unwavering, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it demanded more. I glanced at the chest in the corner of the room, its lid slightly ajar. Inside was the blackened stone, its surface smooth and warm to the touch. I had found it in the attic weeks ago, hidden among old belongings left behind by the cabin's previous owner. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Now, it felt like the only thing that could save me. I reached for the stone, my hands trembling. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. No. Do not touch it. Do not defy us. The fire hissed angrily, its flames surging as if trying to reach me. I gripped the stone tightly, its warmth spreading through me, calming my racing heart. What are you? I whispered, staring into the fire. The flames twisted, forming shapes I couldn't comprehend, their movements slow and deliberate. The shadows outside pressed against the windows, their forms writhing and clawing at the glass. The fire flared one last time, its light blinding, its heat searing. And then, the whispers fell silent. The flames dimmed, their hunger momentarily sated. I sat there, clutching the stone, the silence more deafening than any noise. For the first time in days, I felt something close to hope. But deep down, I knew the fire wasn't done with me. Not yet. The fourth night came like a creeping shadow, dragging with it a cold that seemed to seep into my very bones. The fire roared in the hearth, its light casting jagged shapes across the walls. Yet, no matter how fiercely it burned, the cabin felt colder, emptier, as if something unseen had drawn away all warmth. I sat in the chair closest to the fire, the same chair where I had spent countless sleepless nights. My body was a collection of aches and tremors, my mind a fog of exhaustion and fear. The whispers had grown quieter throughout the day, almost as if they were waiting for something. That silence was worse than the noise. I stared into the flames, searching for answers in their chaotic dance. The figures that had appeared so vividly before were absent now, but the fire still felt alive. It wasn't just burning, it was watching, waiting, judging. By midnight, the fire's hunger was insatiable. The logs I had gathered earlier in the day were already dwindling, devoured by flames that seemed to burn hotter, brighter, with every passing hour. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, more demanding. Feed it. Do not let it die. I rose from the chair, my legs unsteady, and stumbled toward the door. The thought of venturing into the forest again filled me with dread, but I had no choice. Without more wood, the fire would go out, and I couldn't let that happen. The forest was a wall of darkness, its trees standing like sentinels under the pale light of the moon. The air was colder here, biting at my skin, and every sound, every crunch of leaves, every snap of a branch echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I gathered branches, I felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I glanced around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Shadows moved at the edges of the light, their forms indistinct but deliberate. They were closer now, bolder. I could feel their presence pressing against me, suffocating. "Leave me alone," I whispered, clutching the wood to my chest. The shadows didn't respond, but they didn't retreat either. Back at the cabin, I threw the wood onto the fire, watching as the flames surged greedily. The whispers grew louder, their tone almost triumphant, but the sense of relief I felt was fleeting. The fire's demands weren't just endless, they were escalating. I sat by the hearth, staring into the flames, waiting for the next vision. It came quickly, the fire twisting and reshaping itself into familiar images. The man was back, but this time he was surrounded by others. They weren't like him, though. Their forms were darker, their eyes glinting with malice. They moved closer to him, their hands outstretched, their mouths forming words I couldn't hear. The man looked at me through the flames, his face a mask of terror. His lips moved, forming a single, desperate plea. "Help me." The scene dissolved, the fire roaring as if in defiance. I stumbled back, collapsing into the chair, my chest heaving. The whispers were louder now, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that drowned out every thought. I covered my ears, shouting over the noise, "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped, the sudden silence more jarring than the noise. The fire's flames twisted into shapes that sent a chill down my spine. The shadows outside pressed against the windows, their forms barely visible in the flickering light. They were closer now, almost inside. I threw another log onto the fire, the whispers surging with approval. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. It was never enough. That night, the images returned with a vengeance. The man was there again, his condition worse than before. His hands were blackened and raw, his body trembling as he fed the fire. The shadows surrounded him, their movements slow and deliberate, their presence suffocating. He turned to me, his hollow eyes meeting mine. His lips moved, forming words I could finally hear. "You can't save me." The flames surged, and the vision disappeared, leaving me alone with the fire and the whispers. I sat there, trembling, the man's words echoing in my mind. I couldn't save him. But maybe I could save myself. The thought was fleeting, drowned out by the whispers and the fire's relentless demands. As dawn broke, the fire burned steadily, its hunger momentarily sated. But I knew it wouldn't last. The shadows were still there, waiting for their moment to strike. And the fire was just as dangerous. I was trapped between them, a prisoner in a battle I didn't understand. And I was running out of time. The fifth night felt heavier, as if the very air inside the cabin was thickening, pressing down on me. The fire roared relentlessly, its flames climbing higher and brighter, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls. The whispers were no longer subtle, they now overlapped, chaotic and demanding, creating a cacophony that rattled inside my skull. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. The fire wouldn't let me. The woodpile outside was almost gone. The hours I had spent gathering it now felt wasted, as the fire devoured every log with a hunger that seemed more alive than ever. My hands were raw, blistered, and shaking, but there was no time to rest. The fire needed more, and the whispers made sure I didn't forget it. "Feed it. Do not stop." "I can't," I muttered, clutching the last log in my hands. My voice sounded weak, hollow, even to myself. The fire hissed, a sound that almost resembled laughter, as if mocking my defiance. When I dropped the log into the flames, they surged violently, the heat forcing me to stumble back. The whispers grew louder, their tone angry. Not enough. Never enough. I staggered out of the cabin, desperate to escape the fire's suffocating presence. The forest stretched before me, dark and uninviting, its tangled branches reaching out like claws. The shadows were waiting. I could feel them, their eyes fixed on me as I crossed the threshold into their domain. The flashlight in my hand flickered as I pushed deeper into the woods, searching for anything that could fuel the fire. The trees seemed closer together now, their trunks gnarled and twisted. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches in the wind, felt amplified, unnatural. And always, just at the edge of my vision, the shadows moved. I found a small clearing littered with fallen branches and logs. Relief washed over me as I knelt to gather them, but it was short-lived. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched returned. Something moved behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice trembling. The forest didn't respond, but the feeling of eyes on my back didn't fade. I grabbed as much wood as I could carry and hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding with every step. The fire was waiting for me, its flames low and sputtering as I dumped the wood near the hearth. The whispers surged the moment the logs hit the ground, their tone furious and relentless. Too slow. Too little. I threw a log into the fire, then another, watching as the flames roared back to life. The heat was unbearable, the light blinding, but I couldn't look away. The fire's glow filled the room, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The images returned, sharper than ever before. The man was there again, his condition even worse. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his hands blackened and raw. He knelt before his fire, his hands feeding it with trembling motions. The shadows surrounded him, their forms slow and deliberate, their presence suffocating. He turned to me, his hollow eyes meeting mine. His lips moved, forming a single word. "Help." The vision dissolved, the fire roaring as if in defiance. I stumbled back, collapsing into the chair, my chest heaving. The whispers were louder now, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that drowned out every thought. I covered my ears, shouting over the noise, "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped, the sudden silence more jarring than the noise. The fire's flames twisted into shapes that sent a chill down my spine. The shadows outside pressed against the windows, their forms barely visible in the flickering light. They were closer now, almost inside. I threw another log onto the fire, the whispers surging with approval. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. It was never enough. That night, the images returned with a vengeance. The man was there again, his condition worse than before. His hands were blackened and raw, his body trembling as he fed the fire. The shadows surrounded him, their movements slow and deliberate, their presence suffocating. He turned to me, his hollow eyes meeting mine. His lips moved, forming words I could finally hear. "You will become me." The vision shattered as the fire flared, its flames licking at the walls, its heat driving me back. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, the man's words echoing in my mind. "You will become me." By dawn, the cabin was a wreck. The furniture had been stripped down for fuel, the walls bare and scarred from the fire's relentless heat. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold wood, staring into the flames. My body was shaking, my mind racing. I couldn't keep this up. I couldn't. The whispers had subsided, but their presence lingered, a constant pressure against my thoughts. The fire burned steadily, its glow unwavering, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it demanded more. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. By the sixth night, the fire was no longer just a fixture in the cabin, it had become its heart, its master. The walls felt tighter, the ceiling lower, as though the cabin itself was shrinking around me. The air was thick with smoke, but it wasn't the kind that stung my eyes or made me cough. It felt alive, coiling through the room like a serpent, watching, waiting. The stone in my pocket pulsed faintly, a constant warmth that contrasted sharply with the oppressive heat of the fire. It was the only thing that felt real anymore. Everything else, the whispers, the shadows, even the fire, seemed to exist in a realm just beyond my comprehension. But the stone was here, grounding me, reminding me that I hadn't completely lost myself. Not yet. The fire's hunger was relentless. I had burned through almost every piece of furniture, every scrap of wood the cabin had to offer. The whispers were louder now, their demands more frenzied, more insistent. Feed it. Do not let it die. There's nothing left. I shouted, my voice cracking. The fire roared, its flames licking at the walls, threatening to consume what little remained of the cabin. The shadows outside pressed closer, their forms clearer than ever. They moved like smoke, their limbs stretching unnaturally, their eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. They didn't try to enter. They didn't need to. The fire was their ally, their weapon, and it was winning. I gripped the stone tighter, its warmth seeping into my palm. It felt heavier now, almost alive, as though it were aware of the fire, of the shadows, of everything. The whispers shifted, their tone changing from anger to something more desperate. Do not defy us. You cannot win. Morning came with no relief. The fire burned on, its glow casting long, flickering shadows across the bare walls. The whispers had faded, but the silence they left behind was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, and it pressed against me like a physical weight. I sat on the floor, staring into the flames, the stone resting in my lap. The fire wasn't as bright as it had been, but it was still strong, still alive. The cabin felt like a tomb, and I its sole occupant. The journals from the chest lay scattered around me, their pages filled with cramped, frantic handwriting. I had read them all now, each entry more chilling than the last. The previous owner had faced the same fire, the same whispers, the same shadows. And like me, they had tried to resist. But they had failed. One entry stood out, written in dark, jagged letters that seemed to leap off the page. The fire is a doorway. The stone is the key. To end this, one must step through. There is no return. I read the words over and over, their meaning sinking into me like a blade. A doorway. A key. No return. The stone pulsed in my hand, its warmth steady, almost reassuring. The fire hissed, as if sensing my thoughts. The shadows outside shifted, their forms growing darker, more solid. They were waiting. What happens if I don't? I asked aloud, my voice trembling. The fire offered no answers, only its relentless heat and light. As the day faded into night, the fire's demands became unbearable. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus that made my head throb. Feed it. Do not let it die. Feed it everything. I stood, the stone clutched tightly in my hand, and faced the fire. Its flames twisted and writhed, forming shapes I couldn't understand. The shadows outside pressed against the windows, their eyes glowing brighter, their movements more frantic. No, I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. You can't have anything else. The fire roared, its flames surging toward me, but I didn't move. The stone grew warmer in my hand, its pulse quickening, matching the frantic beat of my heart. The whispers screamed, their voices blending into a single, piercing wail. And then, silence. The fire dimmed, its flames retreating, shrinking back into the hearth. The shadows outside froze, their forms wavering, as though unsure of what to do. The stone in my hand pulsed one last time, then went still. For the first time in days, the cabin was quiet. The fire still burned, but its hunger was gone, its presence subdued. The shadows began to fade, retreating into the forest, their glowing eyes the last thing to disappear. I sank to the floor, the stone still clutched in my hand, and stared into the flames. They burned softly now, their light gentle, almost soothing. The whispers were gone, the shadows vanquished. But the words from the journal lingered in my mind. The fire is a doorway. The stone is the key. The the battle was over, but the war wasn't. Not yet. The seventh night descended with a weight that felt almost unbearable. The fire burned softly now, its once violent hunger replaced by a quiet intensity. The stone in my hand had grown cold, its once steady pulse gone. For the first time in days, the whispers were silent. But the silence wasn't a reprieve. It was a warning. I stood by the hearth, staring into the embers. The shadows had retreated, their presence less immediate, but the forest outside remained dark and watchful. I could feel it, the unseen tension coiled around the cabin like a predator waiting to strike. The journal lay open on the floor beside me. Its words felt heavier now, their implications clear. To end this, one must step through. There is no return. The fire wasn't just a threat, it was a choice. And that choice was mine to make. The morning came with a pale, reluctant light. I stepped outside, the air biting and crisp. The forest stretched before me, its trees towering and gnarled, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. For weeks, this place had been my prison, its shadows stalking me, its silence mocking my every step. Now, it felt different. The forest wasn't waiting anymore. It was watching. I ventured deeper than I ever had, my footsteps crunching against the frost-covered ground. The shadows that had once danced at the edges of my vision were gone, but their absence was unsettling. It was as though the forest itself had drawn back, giving me space, granting me one final moment of clarity. At the heart of the woods, I found what I hadn't known I was looking for, a clearing. At its center stood a circle of stones, ancient and weathered, their surfaces etched with runes I couldn't read. The air was colder here, still and silent. The fire in my mind, the one I had carried with me for weeks, seemed to flicker, its presence less certain. I knelt in the center of the circle, the stone clutched tightly in my hand. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, their voices weaving through the stillness. Do not do this. The fire's light flared in my mind, and for a moment, I was back in the cabin, staring into its flames. They twisted and writhed, forming shapes that felt too familiar, the man, the woman, the child. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and mechanical. The man turned to me, his lips moving silently, and then his voice broke through the whispers. It will take everything. By the time I returned to the cabin, the fire had grown. Its flames were higher, more vibrant, their light filling the room with an intensity that felt oppressive. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of demands and accusations. Do not let it die. Feed it. Obey. I placed the stone on the hearth, its surface dark and smooth. The fire hissed, its flames recoiling as though in fear. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, their voices overlapping, blending into a single, desperate cry. Do not defy us. The words from the journal echoed in my mind. The fire is a doorway. The stone is the key. I reached for the stone, its surface cold and unyielding. The fire surged, its flames reaching for me, but I didn't pull back. The stone pulsed faintly, its light spreading through my hand, up my arm, filling me with a warmth that wasn't the fire's. And then I stepped into the hearth. The fire didn't burn me. Its flames parted, revealing a swirling void of light and shadow. It was beautiful and terrifying, a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes that defied comprehension. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through my very core. I took another step, the void pulling me in. The cabin disappeared, the fire, the shadows, the forest, all of it fading into nothingness. For a moment, I felt weightless, untethered, as though I had been freed from everything that had ever bound me. But then the void began to shift. Shapes emerged from the chaos, their forms indistinct but purposeful. They moved toward me, their presence overwhelming, their intent clear. The fire always takes. I clutched the stone, its warmth the only anchor I had, and stared into the void. It wasn't an end. It was a beginning. A doorway. And I had stepped through. When I awoke, the cabin was silent. The fire was gone, its hearth cold and empty. The The shadows had vanished, their presence nothing more than a memory. The stone lay on the floor beside me, its surface cracked, its light extinguished. The forest outside was still, its trees standing tall and silent under the pale morning light. I stepped outside, the air crisp and clean, and looked up at the sky. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't thought possible. Peace. The fire was gone. The whispers were silenced. The shadows were defeated. But as I stood there, staring into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. Something unseen. Something waiting. The fire was a doorway, and I had stepped through. The cabin was still. The fire that had dominated my every waking moment, its insatiable hunger and oppressive whispers, was gone. Its absence left the room cold and quiet, a silence so profound it felt almost unnatural. The hearth, once the center of this madness, was empty, its blackened bricks a stark reminder of what had been. I stood in the middle of the room, the stone clutched in my hand. Its surface was cracked now, its light extinguished, but it still felt warm, as though it retained some lingering trace of its power. My legs trembled, my body weak from days of exhaustion and fear, but I couldn't bring myself to sit. The stillness felt fragile, as if any movement might shatter it. Stepping outside, I was met with a forest transformed. The trees stood tall and silent, their gnarled branches no longer twisting toward the cabin like claws. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue streaked with soft clouds. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the forest was just that, a forest. I walked aimlessly, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The tension that had clung to the woods, the oppressive presence that had haunted my every step, was gone. Yet, as I moved deeper into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Not the malevolent gaze of the shadows, but something else. Something quieter. Patient. The clearing appeared ahead of me, the circle of stones standing as they had the day before. Their surfaces were smooth and weathered, their etched runes faint but unmistakable. I stepped into the circle, the cold air biting at my skin, and knelt in its center. The whispers had warned against this, had pleaded and threatened. But they were gone now, silenced by the fire's defeat. I placed the stone on the ground before me, its cracked surface gleaming faintly in the pale light. The fire was a doorway, the journals had said. The stone was the key. But the doorway had closed, and the key was broken. Or so I thought. As I stared at the stone, the air around me began to shift. It was subtle at first, a faint ripple like heat rising from asphalt. Then the ground beneath me seemed to tremble, a low vibration that resonated through my bones. The runes on the stones glowed softly, their light pulsing in time with the vibration. I didn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot, but curiosity held me there. The stone pulsed once, then twice, its cracks glowing faintly. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. And then the whispers returned. "You have opened it." The voice was not the chaotic cacophony I had endured before. It was singular, calm, and deeply resonant. It filled the clearing, pressing against me from all sides, a presence as much as a sound. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. The stone pulsed again, and the rune's glow grew brighter. The fire was not the end. It was the beginning. "You have stepped through. Now you must decide." "Decide what?" The ground trembled more violently now, the stones around me shifting as though alive. The voice didn't answer directly, but the meaning was clear. The fire had been a doorway. I had stepped through it. And now I stood on the threshold of something far greater, far more dangerous. The light from the stones dimmed, their glow fading until the clearing was bathed only in the pale light of the sky. The stone at my feet cracked further, its surface splitting into fragments that dissolved into the earth. The presence that had filled the clearing receded, leaving behind a silence that was almost suffocating. I stood, my legs unsteady, and turned back toward the cabin. The path through the forest felt longer now, the trees taller, their branches darker. The transformation of the forest had been temporary, an illusion granted by the fire's absence. Whatever I had done in the clearing, whatever I had awakened, was not finished with me. When I reached the cabin, the hearth was no longer empty. A faint, flickering light glowed within, barely visible but unmistakable. The fire was not gone. It had not been defeated. It had simply changed. The whispers returned as I stepped inside, faint but growing stronger with every breath I took. They were no longer demanding, no longer cruel. They were patient now, waiting, as if they knew something I didn't. I sat in the chair closest to the fire, staring into its faint glow. The stone was gone, its purpose fulfilled, but its absence left a void I couldn't ignore. The fire was not my enemy, not anymore. It was a part of me now, as much as I was a part of it. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, clear command. Guard it. I stayed in that chair for hours, watching the fire grow stronger, feeding it with the few logs I had left. The shadows didn't return. The forest outside remained still. But the cabin no longer felt like mine. It was a part of something larger, something I couldn't yet comprehend. The fire was a doorway. The stone was the key. And I was its guardian. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, the fire's glow filled the cabin, steady and unyielding. The whispers faded once more, leaving me alone with the flames. For now, the battle was over. But the war was just beginning.